So delighted to introduce to you Patricia Sullivan, who is the William Arthur Ferry II Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. She's also taught at the University of Virginia and Harvard, and for nearly 20 years, she and Waldo Martin Jr. co-directed a series of NEH summer institutes that were sponsored by Harvard University on teaching the history of civil rights and Black freedom struggles since the Reconstruction era to high school teachers. She has written a good number of books looking at the African American experience and civil rights struggle in the United States, including Lift Every Voice, the NAACP, and the Making of the Civil Rights Movement, and Days of Hope, Race and Democracy in the New Deal Era, and her most recent book, which will come out on June 8th. Patricia says she just received her own copy today. We will be sending you a reminder on June 8th to let you know that we have it in our library and to give you a link so that you can purchase the book yourself. But right now, she's here to give her first talk about her almost out book, Justice Rising, Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White, which I believe is going to be a topic which has many resonances and meaning today, not just for everyone who has lived through that era, but who is living through today's times. So tonight, please join me warmly in welcoming Patricia Sullivan to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I want to thank Beth Hessel for inviting me to participate in the speaker series hosted by the Philadelphia Athenaeum, and Tess Gallen for organizing this event. And thank you all for joining. A special shout out to my mother from New York. One of the great advantages of Zoom is that hopefully technology did not interfere, and she's on as well. So yeah, I'll begin by talking briefly about 1966 as a window onto the shifting racial struggles of that decade, which really frames my study of Robert Kennedy. It's the subject of my new book. In the wake of the historic passages of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled the racial caste system in the South, America's cities became racial battlegrounds. 1966 marked the third consecutive summer of urban uprisings. Confrontations often ignited by abusive policing and fueled by the poverty, substandard schools, dilapidated housing, and rampant unemployment that marked the lives of African Americans crowded into segregated areas of America's cities. Stokely Carmichael's call for Black Power earlier that summer resonated with African Americans across the country. While the mainstream media, moderate civil rights leaders, and most of the political establishment condemned Black Power as racist and divisive. The urban crisis that gripped the country by the later 1960s prompted calls for law and order, as some politicians sought advantage by appealing to white fears and resentments. In October 1966, Senator Robert Kennedy spoke to an overflow audience of 15,000 people packed into the Greek Theater on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. He described the spirit of dissent and civic activism evident in this generation of college students as, quote, the hope of our nation. The future, he said, would belong to those who blend passion, reason, and courage in a personal commitment to the ideals and great enterprises of American society. He continued, no area of national life needs this leadership more than the challenges we have gathered to consider. The revolution within our gates, the struggle of Negro Americans for full equality and for full freedom. And I should note for younger people in the audience that Negro was the term commonly used at this time. It's going to be switching to Black and African American as time goes forward, but it was an acceptable and the commonly used term in the mid-1960s. Kennedy, who had played a leading role in the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, understood that persistent racial inequality could not be remedied by legislation, by a lawsuit, or by a single program. Overcoming inequality, he said, would require, quote, overcoming the scarred heritage of centuries of oppression. Most Americans, white and Black, had voiced opposition to riots and violence, and that was certainly justified, Kennedy noted. However, he observed that, quote, white backlash often masked hostility to complete fulfillment of equal opportunity and treatment, which contains opposition to demands for justice and freedom, and which denies the need to destroy slums, provide education, and eliminate poverty. That, he warned, is, quote, wrong, shameful, immoral, and self-defeating. And any leader who sought to exploit such resentments for momentary advantages fails his duty to the people of the country. We must face our difficulties and strive to overcome them, or turn away, bringing repression, increasing human pain, and civil strife. Now, Robert Kennedy in 1966 was rare among national political figures. And it was this aspect of Bobby Kennedy's public life that intrigued me and set me on the course that resulted in my recently published book. So I want to go back a little bit and just look at the framing of how he comes in to this awareness and engagement with the racial struggles that crest in the 1960s. In 1960, Robert Kennedy was 34 years old. That year, as a manager of John Kennedy's presidential campaign, his life converged with the Black freedom movement, exposing him to realities that had been beyond his vision or concern. 1960 was the year that the sit-ins ignited mass protests across the South, and Bob Moses made his first trip to Mississippi, developments that would fuel the final push of the Southern-based civil rights movement. By 1960, Black migration had transformed America. While more than 90% of African Americans lived in the South in 1910, by 1960, nearly half of African Americans lived in the North and West, where segregation was deeply entrenched in these urban communities. But free to vote, Black voters in the North had emerged as a powerful voting bloc in national politics. Robert Kennedy evidenced little knowledge or concern about African Americans prior to 1960, and in this way, he was like most white Americans. The country was completely segregated, North, West, and South, up through the 1950s. As his brother's campaign manager, he understood the importance of the Black vote in northern states. Meanwhile, as he campaigned across the country, he began to see racial conditions firsthand. JFK ran on a strong civil rights platform, and the Black vote proved critical in his very close election. Now, many historians have been critical of the Kennedys for not doing more early in the administration. But my research revealed that by the time John Kennedy took office in January of 1961, both brothers recognized race as more than a political issue to be managed. They saw it as a national problem with deep historical roots and one that the country had to face. Yet they faced major political constraints. While Democrats held a slight majority in Congress, powerful Southern Democrats who chaired many of the congressional committees were a bulwark in defense of segregation. The administration, however, worked beyond public view to create a way forward. As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy assembled a brilliant team of lawyers and was prepared to put the weight of the federal government behind school desegregation and the enforcement of voting rights. But less than 4 months into the Kennedy administration, an interracial group, the Freedom Riders, tested their right to travel together across the South in the wake of 2 Supreme Court decisions barring segregation in interstate travel. Their bus was firebombed in Anniston, Alabama. The riders were assaulted by mobs in Birmingham and Montgomery as police stood by, and only the presence of federal marshals prevented a white mob from burning down a church hosting a mass meeting that included over 1,000 people and Martin Luther King. During those tense days, Robert Kennedy got a close look at how local and state officials sanctioned violence in defiance of law in their dedication to maintaining segregation. Speaking of government officials in Alabama, he commented to an aide, "They're at war with this country." By 1961, Kennedy's attention was also drawn to the poverty, segregation, and criminal justice abuses that plagued Black communities in the North and West. He helped establish federally supported community-based youth groups in 16 cities across the country and visited each one of them, seeing conditions firsthand. And this, I found, was an important trait of Bobby Kennedy and one of the fun things of writing about him. As a civil rights activist remembered, he went, he saw, he listened, he grew. Early in '63, speaking at an event commemorating the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, Kennedy took stock of conditions in the United States and described a racial crisis 100 years in the making. The consequences of racial discrimination, he said, were massive and carry on for generation after generation. To face this openly and squarely, he said, is the challenge of the decade. Later that spring in '63, the crisis in the South reached a breaking point in Birmingham, which I'm sure many of you know about. Martin Luther King had led an organizing mass protest against segregation in downtown department stores. And as hundreds of children and high school students marched through the cities, the police attacked them with dogs and fire hoses. These images flashed around the country, triggering large demonstrations in Black communities across America. So the lid was coming off. That's how many people saw it. It kind of captured what James Baldwin described as the fire next time in his book published earlier that year. The Kennedy administration was prepared to seize the moment. RFK and his team in the Justice Department drafted civil rights legislation that would outlaw segregation in public and privately owned public places. JFK began a series of meetings in the White House, group meetings, which included businessmen, religious groups, lawyers, women's organizations, labor and civil rights leaders, in a massive push to organize public support behind strong civil rights legislation. And the Kennedy brothers worked in tandem to cultivate the support of Republicans in Congress, which would be essential to defeating a Southern-led filibuster without compromising away key provisions of the bill. So as we think of challenges today, I mean, this was a pretty tough needle to thread at this point, because Republicans certainly did not want to give a victory to a Democratic president. On June 11th, President Kennedy appealed to his fellow citizens in what was one of his most powerful addresses. And I urge all of you to read it at some point. It's really, it speaks across time. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, North and South, where legal remedies are not at hand, the president warned. Now is the time for the nation to fulfill its promises. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. And he concluded by announcing that he would introduce a major civil rights bill. So that's June of '63. And over the next several months, the Kennedy team navigated pressures from the left and opposition on the right with a laser focus on producing a strong bill that could hold essential Republican support. And it really is a fascinating story of high wire politics, joined with a deep commitment to finally securing federal power necessary to end Jim Crow in the South and expand federal protection of basic citizenship rights. So on November 20th, 1963, the day before President Kennedy left for Dallas, the House Judiciary Committee passed the proposed legislation, which pretty much guaranteed that it would pass in the House of Representatives. As you know, the president was assassinated 2 days later. The bill that JFK and his team had crafted would survive, largely intact, prevail over a Southern filibuster in the Senate, and be signed into law by President Johnson on July 2nd, 1964. Now, I was 12 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated, a traumatic moment seared in my memory. But in writing this book, I experienced the tragedy and the enormity of the loss in a new way. Its impact on Robert Kennedy was immeasurable. Some who knew RFK or wrote about him later concluded that the assassination changed him, but those closest to him disagreed. Walter Sheridan, who had worked with Bobby since the 1950s, recalled that his manner had been much more reflexive and outgoing, and after the assassination, he was more soul-searching and inward. but he always had the basic compassion and feelings and always was who he was. Mortimer Kaplan, who was Bobby's law professor at UVA and who had worked in the Kennedy administration, put it this way: he was like the blocking back for his brother. But I think you got to know him better afterwards. He was more and more himself. Continuity and growth are seen most clearly in Bobby Kennedy's relationship to the changing dynamics of the civil rights Black Power movement, as a center of attention shifted from the South to the racial crisis that explodes in American cities, really starting in 1964. Robert Kennedy became senator from New York in 1965, a year that was marked by the dramatic escalation of the war in Vietnam and the uprising in the Watts section of Los Angeles that summer, one of the largest racial disturbances in American history. On a hot evening in August, Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old Black man, was driving his mother's Buick on Avalon Boulevard in South Central LA when he was stopped by a California Highway Patrol officer. The officer had noticed that the car was weaving. A crowd of 50 gathered while the patrol officer gave Fry a sobriety test, which he failed. When Fry refused to get into the patrol car, the officer drew his gun. Fry's mother tried to intervene and was handcuffed. By this time, 8 Los Angeles police cars arrived on the scene, ratcheting up tensions. The crowd of 50 that had initially gathered had grown to nearly 200. And some began shouting as they handcuffed Fry's mother, his brother, and several other people in the crowd. Residents later described rough treatment by the police and racial slurs. And I think what this episode shows is that the relationships with the police across time was so fraught that it didn't take much to really spark a confrontation back and forth. And street battles began that night between the crowd and police, and then spilled over into the next day and raged for 5 days. By the end of it, 34 people were dead, mostly African American, and large sections of the city were in ashes. Calls for law and order were the dominant response to Watts by public officials. Senator Robert Kennedy was one of the few to push back. He said, "There is no point in telling Negroes to obey the law. To many Negroes, the law is the enemy. In Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, it has almost always been used against him." And by law, Kennedy was not just referring to the police, but to the failure of law to protect Black people living in overcrowded urban neighborhoods from unscrupulous landlords, substandard living conditions, and merchants who cheated them. Just days after Watts, he delivered a speech to a mostly white gathering in Spring Valley, New York. His comments focused on what happened in Los Angeles and the vital importance of mobilizing the nation's will and resources to meet a crisis that he described as unparalleled in our history. He mentioned the challenges facing Black leadership and the need to help cultivate and support leadership from within urban Black communities, but he was mostly concerned with his white audience. Quote, "We have been strangely insensitive to the problems of Northern Negroes." He asked them to think about what they valued in their lives and consider the sources of their self-esteem. Surely prominent among them were contributions we can make to ourselves, our families, and our communities, and how all of these things are built around the work we do. Now he asked them, imagine a community like Watts, where many people were without work. Lack of work meant lack of money and living in overcrowded, rat-infested housing. These conditions were compounded by blighted hopes and disappointments by those who left the South for what many of them called the promised land. Instead, they found themselves crowded into a dirty, stinky, uncared for, closet-sized section of a great city. Their children inherited the lot of their parents, the disappointment, the anger, with little hope of deliverance. He asked, where does one run to when he's already in the promised land? Kennedy emphasized how the struggle for justice and freedom in the North was different from the civil rights movement in the South. Northern problems are the problems of everyday living, he said. Sit-ins would not change the fact that many adults were illiterate having been denied access to a decent education. Marches would not create jobs for Black youth. While rioting and violence could not be condoned, he insisted that just saying obey the law is not going to work. We have a long way to go before the law means the same thing to a Negro as it does to us. The deprivation and suffering of the ghettos was not simply a problem for African Americans, he said, but a problem that afflicted American society. Addressing it had to become part of the public agenda. Referencing the nation's pride in its revolutionary history, he said, I think there is no doubt that if Washington or Jefferson or Adams were Negroes in a northern city today, they would be at the forefront of the effort to change the conditions under which the Negro lives. Kennedy visited Watts 3 months later with his aide, Peter Edelman. They walked through the burnout sections of the city, talking with people in the community. It was like seeing a war-torn area in your own country, Edelman recalled. When they dropped into the office of a local newspaper in the heart of Watts, they were surprised to find a homemade Robert Kennedy for President poster hanging on the wall. Peter said, we got a kick out of that. What Kennedy described as a crisis unparalleled in our history would remain at the center of his attention and action. It was a crisis that involved multiple dimensions. Centered in the desperate conditions in Black urban communities, it involved problems of poverty, of elevating national awareness, of marshaling government and private resources, and countering what he saw as a key problem, a politics that appealed to white racial fears, ignorance, prejudice, and resentment. From 1965 to 1968, Kennedy moved on multiple fronts to meet this crisis and broaden his own awareness. An active supporter of the war on poverty, Kennedy participated in Senate hearings held in the field. They would just go out to places around the country and talk with people directly in their communities to expose and see conditions and evaluate the impact of government programs. These hearings took him to migrant labor camps, Indian reservations, destitute coal mining communities in rural Kentucky, the Mississippi Delta, as well as urban areas. While Kennedy pushed for increased funding and more targeted anti-poverty programs, LBJ's war on poverty stalled as the Johnson administration became increasingly consumed by Vietnam. By 1966, the war on poverty, in the words of Martin Luther King, had been reduced to scarcely a skirmish. During this period, and this was another interesting part of researching and writing this book, the work of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King became closely aligned. Both emerged as national voices focusing attention on the root causes of urban uprisings and on the scourge of poverty in the United States. In December of 1966, King testified as part of a six-week-long Senate hearing on the crisis in American cities, which Robert Kennedy helped to organize. The hearings provided a platform for King to reflect on his experiences in Chicago, where he was working with local organizations to end racial discrimination in housing. In his statement before the committee, King offered a probing analysis of what the civil rights movement had achieved and what it had exposed. While the stigma of racial caste had been removed, many African Americans remained, in King's words, handicapped by the stigma of poverty in a society whose measure of value revolves around money. Senator Kennedy engaged King in a lengthy discussion. He asked King if the despair and alienation of people living in urban ghettos was understood by the people outside. A blunt no was the response. The problem of the ghetto, you know, King said to Kennedy, is that those living in the ghetto are often invisible, thoughts unknown, words unheard, feelings unfelt. Kennedy acknowledged that such conditions, along with lack of awareness on the part of most Americans, created a dire situation. King agreed. Riots, he warned, in the final analysis, turn out to be the language of the unheard. While acknowledging the enormity of the crisis and working to raise national awareness, Kennedy also acted. In 1966, he and his aides, working with community activists and leaders, created the Bedford-Stuyvesant Renewal and Rehabilitation Corporation. It was a novel concept, one that brought government, foundation, and private funds to bear on addressing the shortage of decent housing, recreational facilities, and jobs to a project that was run by a board comprised of members of the Bed-Stuy community. The community ran board-developed programs for the physical, social, and economic development of Bedford-Stuyvesant, creating jobs and job training for residents, while a parallel board of business and financial advisors secured funds and provided advice as needed. A historian has recently described this project as Black Power in action. Kennedy remained closely involved with the project up until his death. But larger political challenges loomed as the country became deeply divided over the Vietnam War and the growing racial crisis. The summer of 1967, known in popular culture as the Summer of Love, was a season of the deadliest and most widespread racial strife in US history. Racial clashes, disorders, and rebellions erupted in 164 cities in 34 states. The violence and disorder that summer intensified the country's political polarization while exposing the failure of the Johnson administration to seriously address the urban crisis. Deadliest episodes occurred in Newark and Detroit, each triggered by instances of police brutality and fueled by years of racial oppression and desperate conditions. 4 days of battles between residents and police, National Guard, and federal troops in Detroit left 43 people dead, 33 of whom were African American. More than 2,000 were injured, and there were 5,000 arrests. Property damage was estimated at $100 million, 3 times the damage in Watts. Americans watched on their nightly news shows as the nation's 5th largest city turned into a veritable war zone. The uprisings that summer reinforced dominant white opinion of Black urban communities as dangerous, violent, and crime-infested places, and helped to justify the militarization of urban policing. They also set up a scramble for political advantage and scapegoats, amplifying calls for law and order. In a televised speech to the nation, President Johnson announced the establishment of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which became known as the Kerner Commission, to study the causes of the riots. He denounced, quote, the criminals who committed acts of violence against the people, and announced that the Defense Department was preparing new training standards for riot control. At the end of his comments, he acknowledged that the long-term solution was to attack the conditions that breed despair and violence, but he made no commitment to escalating the war on poverty. He asked the country to pray. After watching the speech, RFK said to his aide, Frank Mankiewicz, that's it. The president is not going to do anything more. He's through with domestic problems with the cities. Frank Mankiewicz, who I interviewed, later recalled the Detroit riots and the terrible feeling RFK had when he watched Johnson that night had shifted his thinking about running for president in 1968. Kennedy's decision to run for president and challenge Lyndon Johnson involved many considerations. So it took him months and much thinking and weighing and watching. If he ran, it would not be as a protest. He would run to win and change things. In November of '67, Eugene McCarthy declared his candidacy for the Democratic nomination on an anti-Vietnam War platform. He gave no attention to the issues of race or poverty. 2 events contributed to RFK entering the race. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which began on January 31st, 1968, exposed Lyndon Johnson's false claims that America was winning the war. That was followed a month later on February 29th, 1968, with the release of the Kerner Commission report. The report boldly documented the poverty, joblessness, police brutality, and alienation that fueled Black rebellions in the cities, and warned that, quote, discrimination and segregation, which had long permeated American life, now threatens the future of every American. President Johnson rejected the report and its conclusions. Robert Kennedy declared his candidacy for president on March 16, 1968. I run, he said, because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have strong feelings about what must be done, and that I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them. Now, as Kennedy embarked on his presidential campaign, Martin Luther King was organizing national support for his Poor People's Campaign, preparing to bring thousands of poor people to Washington to protest economic and racial injustice and to compel the government to act. And, we know what's going to happen, but if you're in the moment looking forward, it's quite amazing to see these two individuals moving in this direction at this fleeting moment. Each of them, Kennedy and King, offered a unique kind of national leadership that had been forged in the tumult of the 1960s and shaped by their experiences during the peak years of the Civil Rights Movement. While the Civil Rights Movement brought deeper racial inequities to the surface, it also fostered a shift in American political culture, loosening the grip of Cold War politics and reigniting the belief that government should serve the common good and that civic engagement was worth the attention of a younger generation. In an intense 10 weeks, Bobby Kennedy campaigned in all parts of the country. It was just tireless. And a theme in all kinds of people, all kinds of groups. And he really showed such a faith in Americans across the board, of all backgrounds, races, etc. He appealed to the dedication and faith that had stirred citizens to work for justice, for racial justice and social justice, and to protest the Vietnam War in an effort to build a political movement capable of changing the country. Barely 3 weeks into his campaign, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Kennedy at the time was campaigning in Indiana, and he broke the news at a pre-scheduled nighttime rally in the center of Indianapolis's African-American community. Speaking without notes from the back of a flatbed truck, Kennedy communicated deep anguish and sorrow, and he announced King's death to this group. Many people have not heard, because this is pre-cell phone, if you're out waiting for something to happen, you're not watching TV or listening to the radio. So he delivered the news that many had not heard and really kept the crowd with him as he just spoke, from his heart. And it's a short speech. I really recommend it to you because it conveyed anguish and sorrow. And I'll quote a couple of lines. Martin Luther King, he said, dedicated his life to love and justice between his fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are and what direction we want to move in. Kennedy canceled all campaign events until after Martin Luther King's funeral, except for one, a speech the next day at the City Club in Cleveland, where he spoke movingly about the tragedy of King's assassination and the violence that pervaded American life. Quote, "This is a time of shame and sorrow. It is not a day for politics. I have saved this one moment to speak briefly to you about the mindless menace of violence in America, which stains our land and every one of our lives." A text of that speech is available on the website of the JFK Library, and it's really worthy of your attention. It's a very timeless appeal to American citizens. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy won the California primary, positioning him as a strong contender for the nomination at the Democratic Convention. Shortly after claiming victory, Robert Kennedy was shot, and he died the next day. The assassinations of King and Kennedy cut short 2 lives that carried the hope and promise of their times. Both men have been raised to iconic stature, yet their significance and contemporary relevance lives in their actions and the evolution of their ideas. Their faith in the capacity of democracy to advance a just, equitable, and humane society was tested, but never defeated. As Bayard Rustin commented at the time, both men were fully aware of the risks they faced for trying to work against the grain against the current American moral grain. Yet they accepted the risk and paid the ultimate price for trying to make a difference in their times and for striving to show mankind how it can be better than it is. Now, by the late 1960s, aggressive and militarized policing and mass incarceration prevailed as a response to the urban rebellions sparked by lack of opportunity, substandard conditions, and unjust policing. But that does not diminish what was achieved during the 60s and the legacy that endures. one of the most powerful social movements in American history, through protest, organizing, and insistent demands, broke through, elevating the consciousness of many, and creating both the pressure and the opportunity for government action to dismantle segregation. At the same time, the Black freedom movement grew, exposing the deep roots of racial inequality and changing American culture in fundamental ways. In conclusion, Robert Kennedy's public life was forged in the racial reckoning of the 1960s and speaks to our current moment. His capacity to see and to grow is testimony to what is possible. After Robert Kennedy's death, James Baldwin, with whom he had had a charged exchange as Attorney General, and that is described in the book, but later, looking back in 1970, he reflected on Robert Kennedy. Baldwin said, he had a mind that could be reached. He was somebody in the 20th century with enough passion and energy and patience. Such qualities are essential to meeting the challenges and opportunities that we face today in America's long and ongoing struggle to reckon with our racial past and to secure justice. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I invite any questions, put them in the Q&A or chat. And I know everybody was listening, so they didn't get their cute questions in, but I expect they'll start coming in a moment. So I wanted to start asking what I'm sure is on many of our minds, that, you know, we all know and have our visions and understanding of Robert Kennedy, the Kennedy family. They've been, you know, one of the most studied families in history.
Mm-hmm.
What did you learn that you were not expecting as you were doing your research for this book about Robert Kennedy?
Oh, well, you know, I learned how central he was to the racial struggles and changes in the 1960s, and not because he responded. You know, I mean, the African American movement kind of continually challenged and pushed and really broke open with the sit-ins and other developments, and that he responded. And that was something, you know, historians, myself included, have sort of just had a flip thought, well, the Kennedys, yeah, they didn't do enough, and really sort of a top-down sort of assessment. And when you follow African American history and the dynamic of that struggle, it really showcases and do the research and ask the questions. I think we often assume things without having done the research, and so I was really surprised to see what a formative role he played in concert with the other forces that were moving through our country in this period. Really, it was, and then what that reveals about certain developments in the movement. You know, you kind of have a different angle of vision that sort of collapses this division between civil rights and Black power, and see how they're interconnected. And so,
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate you answering my question. John is wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you found out about the role of faith in Robert Kennedy's development.
that is a great question. It's something that really interested me. I think it was really central. He was a spiritually grounded person. He was a practicing Catholic. He was a serious Catholic. To me, I think of him as sort of a social justice Catholic. I mean, coming out of corporal works of mercy, the teachings of the Catholic Church that are really geared towards social justice and you know, doing for others, and so I really, and when you look at, it's hard to like track that as this, but knowing, I in the beginning of the book, I go back into his background. You know, who is this person who, before he gets to 1960, what prepares him to respond the way he did? And that's part of it. You know, that is definitely part of it. That sort of, and which also, you know, conveys a kind of humility. I mean, you have a sense of something larger than yourself, but yeah, I think his faith was, and certainly after, you know, the loss he went through, I think that really had to help steady him as he moved forward and continued on.
Did he have any kind of an uphill battle or walls that he had to break against with this, coming from the Kennedys, that he had to work to gain the trust of the African American community in the civil rights leadership, or was he accepted at face value from the beginning?
I think as people met him, I think what surprised me in writing the book is that the Kennedys, people in the South note this and then they just sort of roll their eyes. But, if you would go, many Black homes, they would have a picture of Jesus, Martin Luther King, and John Kennedy. People why they have him up there? But again, if you look at the response to Kennedy, it's just, so there wasn't, I think civil rights activists were questioning, when they were being beat up and when they went to vote, why didn't they do more? And I think that's a complicated question in terms of the limited power of the president to intervene in terms of police powers. I mean, you can send the army, but how many times can you do that? I mean, they did that in Mississippi when the governor blocked the integration of them. So I think on an individual basis, someone like John Lewis, who I interviewed, he was, kind of suspicious of Kennedy, and then he met him in 1963 in the Justice Department because there was a big disturbance in Cambridge, Maryland, and he just saw him and understood that he understood. And Kennedy also said to John Lewis that the young people have taught me, you have taught me. So on a one-on-one, I think meeting him. But again, if you were out struggling, you wanted more to happen. That makes sense. But overall, I think people really grew. And as time went on, if you look at the Black press and just talk with people, they became, both he and his brother were deeply admired and often loved by many people for what they did.
Well, your point there is comment about the presidents can be limited by how much they can actually do. Their power is more limited than we sometimes would like it to be to address changes. But Sue Ellen asked in relation to that, wondering if he'd lived and become president, do you have some sense of maybe what difference that might have made? Obviously, there's a lot of different, a lot of conjecturing, but what difference might he have made?
Someone compared
with social justice and civil rights.
Oh yeah, again, I'll weigh in and speculate because I think it's a great question. I read this somewhere, I should have written it down, that think of Hoover and Roosevelt and think if Hoover had won in 1932, okay? So we had RFK and Nixon wins. What if RFK won? It just would have been a whole different team, the way he functioned, the way he brought in the best people in terms of, what he did in the Justice Department, they would have had access to the media. When he was critical of Johnson after the Detroit speech, Frank Mankiewicz said, okay, what would you do? And, smarty pants. And he said, I would, on 2 occasions, he said, what do you do? I would call the head of each of the 3 networks, that's what we had back then, and have them go into these communities and film a day in the life. And then Bobby Kennedy described it was like to be a Black child waking up in poverty with, just what it was like, the conditions of your home, the lack of education, all that. And I think, what we saw with the Kennedys, they motivated and mobilized people and tapped into talent and, were able to do that. So I think at that point in 68, it's just something to imagine what it would have meant. Yeah. Because I think what we forget when we see how the country did turn and it was moving in different, that there was tremendous potential coming out of the 1960s. People had faith in government in ways that they hadn't before. I mean, after the Chicago Convention in 68 and the riots, police riots, that just went away. And so no, I think it would have been, it's really lovely to think about and sad too.
Yeah. And Brian asks if we know if RFK persuaded his brother to put civil rights legislation front and center in the summer of 63, or was it more of a mutual coming together of the 2 of them on the question of civil rights?
It was a mutual coming together. I mean, Robert Kennedy was more in the trenches, and he really understood everything that was going on with his. He had lawyers in the South, and he was. But John Kennedy was understood, and I think that when he decided to give that speech on June 11th, which was the day that the University of Alabama was integrated, everybody, all of his advisors advised him against it, except Robert Kennedy. They were all against it. You have a re-election coming up, it's politically, and no, I'm going to do it. And he said to his brother, this may be my political swan song. But they had confidence that, that they had confidence in the country, I think, and that they could really, push things forward. But I think more than people can imagine, they both were engaged. And one sidebar, again, in my research, Thurgood Marshall, who was the great NAACP attorney who won the Brown decision and the rest, John Kennedy asked Marshall to come see him in April of 1960. That's when he's a candidate. And Marshall, in an oral history interview at the JFK Library, said he went there for lunch. He said, I stayed all afternoon. He said he understood everything about voting, both sides. And he said, I was confident that he totally believed in equality and having to, get that, and that he would move as time allowed. So yeah, I think that they complemented each other very, very much so.
Had Robert Kennedy seen himself as a potential successor to his brother, even when his brother was in the presidency, or really was this an evolution where it came about really after the after the riots? Or
I don't think he had any interest in running for office while he was serving as Attorney General. He didn't want to be Attorney General. That is also a very good question, because the thing about when, after his brother is killed and he becomes a senator, the speculation about him, I think one of the things I learned that I think is not understood very well is that Lyndon Johnson hated Robert Kennedy, we know that, and Bobby Kennedy didn't like Lyndon Johnson very much. But for Kennedy, the thing that about Johnson that he paid attention to was what he was doing in Vietnam and around race and poverty. And he held back because the press, anytime he spoke out, the press made it like he doesn't like him and he doesn't like him. And he said the issue got sidebarred. And so he really held back. And that was one of the things keeping him from running. If I challenge him, they're going to just say it's, he's jealous. And so, I really feel his push to, he may have had an aspiration to be president at some point. And actually, it's like 1972 is what he was looking for. That was discussed in 66 a bit when he traveled around during the midterm elections, campaigning for people. He had no intention of, but then as things got worse with Vietnam and with the cities, his wife, Ethel, people were divided about whether he should run in 68 or not. His brother didn't want him to run. Ethel wanted him to run because she said he would never forgive himself if he didn't, because the situation was so dire. It really was, when you think about the racial situation and Johnson, who gets so much, credit's the wrong word, but I don't think people fully understand the limits of Lyndon Johnson and really the way he responded to the urban crisis, or failed to, how devastating that really was. And again, his relationship with King, I could go on, so it's all in the book. but again, I think that's one thing that I learned in researching this book that I wasn't aware of. And I think it's a very important piece of history that's not been fully appreciated.
And was he, was RFK listening or making those connections as Black leaders like Baldwin and King and Malcolm X were making about the connection of the racism and those issues with Vietnam and what was happening in Vietnam? Was
To
he also
him,
making the same criticism?
he was. Well, to him, the thing about Vietnam was it was taking the money from poverty programs. And
Right.
initially that was King's problem with Vietnam. But then King really saw it, and they both kind of saw it as just, um, yeah. But when he got to the Senate in '65, he aligned himself quietly because he didn't want to get called out. I mean, with with a group of senators who were questioning, the war as Johnson, began the bombing and the ground troops and all the rest. He was right there. But there was something that question triggered that I thought was interesting, and it's gone away. Yeah, but that's
Well, as soon as we end the program.
they are aligned. But it's really interesting. Oh yeah, here's a really interesting connection that I make a big deal of in my book, because it's great. So when Robert Kennedy goes to South Africa, that's a very important trip. He's invited by the students in the anti-apartheid movement. The government, they invite King too. The government will not give King a visa, the South African government, but they figure they have to give Robert Kennedy one because he might be president someday. So they give him one, but they say you can't bring any American reporters with you. And so off he goes. And it's an amazing visit. And he gives that wonderful speech at the University of Cape Town and the Ripple of Hope. And it's part of his growing, I mean, it really is. And comparing the US and South Africa. While he's in South Africa, James Merritt starts his march against fear, or walk against fear, and he's shot. And Stokely Carmichael, King, and Floyd McKissick continue the march. And that's when Stokely Carmichael, because they're beat up by the police, they have a terrible time, and the media pays really hardly any attention. And Stokely Carmichael finally issues a call for Black Power, which was not new, but it was new to the press, and it became like a big, very polarizing thing. And he meant Black empowerment, and but anyway, it really got taken a certain way in 1966, as I said in the beginning. Kennedy comes back from South Africa, and when they ask him about Black Power, he says, "I'm for empowerment, and I don't think we should not work together." But he never criticized Black Power. And then in August, he wrote an article for Life magazine, or Look, I think it was Look, on his trip to South Africa. And it was the cover story with the title on the cover. And the title of the article, In the Summer of Black Power, is Suppose God is Black. Suppose God is Black. And in the article, you read that when he was talking with people, Africana, they said, well, the Bible says this, that's why we have that. And he said, well, suppose God is Black and you get to heaven. And what are you going to do then? But to just put that out there as a statement in August of '66 on a popular magazine, I thought really showed. And I asked Peter Edelman about it. He said, well, what do you think? And it really is, it's an think about that, white people. You're getting all worked up about a slogan. So I found a number of things that really showed him parallel, aligned with. And when the funeral train took him back to Washington, Ivanhoe Donaldson was on the train, Julian Bond was on the train, many SNCC activists were on the train, and along with all kinds of other people. And then this is very moving, as they were driving him from Union Station to Arlington. It was nighttime by then because the train was delayed. The Poor People's Campaign was camped out in Resurrection City. And the hearse stopped before the Lincoln Memorial. And the people from Resurrection City came and raised their hand like that and joined a chorus and sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I have a picture in my book capturing that moment, which is just really very moving. Yeah.
Wow, that's a great story. Thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of everybody who was here for sharing. And great, Tess, you just put this up. And we will remind you all as we get to June 8th that you can purchase the book. I think you could go on now and pre-order it. So it will be delivered to your doorstep on June 8th. This is obviously, we're going to find out so much more fascinating and illuminating stories about Robert Kennedy and the world in which he lived and which developed him into the man that he was, whose life was cut too short. And we thank you so much, Patricia Sullivan, for joining us tonight at the start of your book tour.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure. And thank everyone for joining in. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. We look forward to seeing everybody again soon. And thank you for joining us this evening for this fantastic talk. Just to remind everybody, on I think it's on Tuesday, we have 2 programs at noon. Jason Karlowicz on the problems of Alzheimer's. If you have a family member, friend, anyone who is dealing with this challenge with them or a loved one, will be a fantastic program to join.